I'm Bob Schieffer. The security of the free world depends on an American victory in Iraq. That's what President Bush said today, and that's where we'll start tonight. Then we'll have these stories.
In the fight against global warming, California goes its own way, legislating a big cut in greenhouse gas emissions. I'm John Blackstone.
I'm Dr. John LaPook on how researchers are finding new ways to boost the body's own defenses to fight cancer.
And it's Bob's last night in the anchor chair. For my first story at CBS, I'll take a look back at his remarkable career.
You want me to tell you a secret? I've really enjoyed it.
This is the CBS Evening News with Bob Schieffer.
Good evening. Well, tonight does mark my last night at this desk, and we'll have more on that later in the broadcast. But as I said on my first broadcast here 18 months ago, the news always will come first here, and there is plenty to report tonight. President Bush has come on strong about Iraq before, but never quite the way he did today. In a speech to the American Legion in Salt Lake City, he said an American withdrawal from Iraq would lead to a conquest by America's worst enemies. It would be so devastating, he went on to say, that the security of the civilized world depends on it. We're going first tonight to the White House and our correspondent there, Jim Axelrod. Jim?
Well, Bob, with less than 10 weeks to Election Day, President Bush is on a rescue mission of sorts for his policy in Iraq. He is speaking in very dramatic terms to draw distinctions with Democrats.
If we give up the fight in the streets of Baghdad, we will face the terrorists in the streets of our own cities.
The president picked one of the most hawkish groups in one of the most conservative states as his audience for remaking his case for the war in Iraq. The American Legion Convention in Salt Lake City, Utah.
The security of the civilized world depends on victory in the war on terror, and that depends on victory in Iraq. So the United States of America will not leave until victory is achieved.
With the latest CBS News New York Times poll showing a majority of Americans still believing there's no connection between the war in Iraq and the war on terror, Mr. Bush is changing tactics to change minds, describing Iraq in epic terms, the scene of a battle between the forces of freedom and liberty on one hand and those of extremism and tyranny on the other.
We should all agree that the battle for Iraq is now central to the ideological struggle of the 21st century.
Clearly, the president has heard his critics who question what the war in Iraq has to do with keeping America safe. He's now answering in terms that recall profound struggles of the past, casting the terrorists who covered Iraq as the latest in a long line of America's enemies.
There are successors to fascists, to Nazis, to communists, and other totalitarians of the 20th century. And history shows what the outcome will be.
The president will continue to hammer at this idea in the run-up to 9/11. It gives him a way to address one of his biggest weaknesses, the war in Iraq, by having it absorbed by one of his biggest strengths, how he's perceived to be handling the war on terror. Bob?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jim. More than 3,500 people died in Iraq in July, most of them civilians. That was the worst month of the war since the invasion. But the U.S. military reported today that the death toll will be considerably lower this month, part of the crackdown on security and the fact that U.S. troop strength is now up to 140,000. That is the most since January. Mark Strassman has been out with some of those troops as they move through some of Baghdad's worst neighborhoods.
No electricity in here. No.
General J.D. Thurman needs time to restore what Baghdad's Adamiyah neighborhood has lost: power. It's been out for 3 blistering months. This man tried sleeping on his roof. Gunshots chased him back inside.
You can't sleep inside because it's too hot. You can't sleep upstairs because it's not safe.
Yes, not safe.
Not safe like most of Baghdad, where a series of explosions today killed more than 50 people. 3 years into the Iraq War, the capital is still so dangerous, Thurman has to lead sweeps through its worst neighborhoods, like Adamiyah. Surrounded by sharpshooters today, he drew a crowd. Just yesterday, this man tells Thurman, gunmen threw his brother in the trunk of a car and disappeared.
What's his name?
Salam. Salam, Arabic for peace, a word rarely heard in Adamiyah. Until this recent crackdown, 15 people a day were murdered here.
For months, gunmen have been coming into this Sunni neighborhood, kidnapping people, killing people, almost at will. From what residents here say, those gunmen are Shia militia members from neighboring Sadr City.
Show me how we shut that down.
Thurman hoped checkpoints on Sadr City's bridges would slow down its killers. But here, where's the barricade his plan called for?
We got that stuff, and that's what's supposed to happen.
A lot here still hasn't happened. Many Iraqis have zero confidence in their new government. Gunmen run wild because there's still no official policy about militias.
Is that frustrating for you as a soldier?
Of course. I need the government to support me, to disarm the militias, or to destroy completely the militias.
Before the dozens of militias here destroy what's left of Iraqi hope. Mark Strassman, CBS News, Baghdad.
Well, as of tonight, we are halfway through hurricane season, and the southeast is bracing for what could be its first hurricane. Ernesto, which is now a tropical storm, is already bringing strong wind and rain to the area. It could hit land sometime tonight, possibly as a hurricane. A hurricane watch is up tonight along the coast of the Carolinas, so we want to bring in our hurricane expert, Brian Norcross from CBS 4 in Miami. Well, Brian, what's ahead here?
Well, it looks like we're going to have a strong storm on the Carolina coast, as you say, Bob, possibly a hurricane. Hurricane hunters were out investigating the storm, flying all through it this afternoon. Couldn't quite find hurricane-force winds, but the expectation is when it comes ashore on the North Carolina coast, somewhere near Cape Fear, just south of Wilmington, may well have winds just over 75 miles an hour. But that's not going to be the end of the story. It's going to be a significant flooding event through eastern North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, on up into the northeast, including as far north as upstate New York.
Well, how long do you think this one's going to take to play out?
It'll take the rest of the week. By the weekend, things should start to taper off, but they're going to feel it even into southern Canada.
And what about that flooding? Where do you think that will be the worst?
Looks like eastern North Carolina into Virginia, possibly Maryland, and then it will start to lighten up as we go north. But they could have problems in eastern Pennsylvania and in New York State as well.
Okay, Brian. Well, thanks a lot. And in the Pacific, where there's a whole different set of hurricane names, Hurricane John has forced evacuation of resorts popular with Americans in Mexico's Baja California peninsula. John is a Category 2 hurricane with 105-mile-an-hour winds. It's headed straight for Cabo San Lucas and other towns on Baja's southern tip. 15,000 people were ordered to leave. Many scientists believe that global warming is contributing to the number and intensity of hurricanes and other storms. The Bush administration has resisted calls to limit greenhouse gas emissions by industry. So, as we first reported last night, California has decided to act on its own and is leading the way now with the toughest emission standards in the country. John Blackstone with more on that.
Going its own way on global warming, America's most populated state intends to roll back its greenhouse gas emissions to the level they were in 1990. California's Republican governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, gave up waiting for the federal government to act.
I love when California is #1 because it's so important that we not only think about, making businesses boom, but we also simultaneously have to protect the environment. And we can't do both.
Other states share California's frustration with the federal response to global warming. At least 17 states have taken some action on their own or have joined lawsuits trying to force Washington to limit greenhouse gases.
And the United States is a quarter of the world's emissions of greenhouse gases. So what our states do matter, what we do matters, and it's a big deal.
Under California's law, big polluters will have to begin reporting their greenhouse gas emissions in 2 years and start to make cuts in 6 years. By 2020, emissions would have to be reduced a full 25%. The refining industry calls the law a potential economic disaster that will drive business and jobs out of the state. But there are also some unlikely supporters.
It shouldn't be a job killer.
That's Peter Darby, CEO of California's biggest utility, Pacific Gas and Electric. What he likes about the new regulations, companies will be able to buy and sell the right to pollute. Those that reduce emissions more than required can sell what's called a credit to companies that haven't reduced emissions enough. Those companies can then apply those credits to cover their excess emissions. Let the market handle pollution.
Exactly right. And most business people that have looked at this have said a market-based system is the best way to address this issue of climate change.
California's high-tech industry likes the new law, too. It doesn't see the expense. It sees money to be made, developing cleaner sources of energy. John Blackstone, CBS News, San Francisco.
And still ahead on the CBS Evening News, doctors call it an exciting development in the battle against cancer. We'll tell you about it next. There may be a new weapon in the battle against melanoma, the skin cancer that kills 8,000 Americans every year. Here's our medical correspondent, Dr. John LaPook.
2 years ago, as 53-year-old Mark Origer faced advanced melanoma, he wondered if he would live to see his daughter's wedding day.
I had reached what they call stage 4 of the disease. Prognosis was approximately about 1 year.
As a last resort, he enrolled in a clinical trial testing a new technique. The treatment worked for only 2 of 17 patients, but Origer was one of them. Almost immediately, his tumors began to shrink.
This is pre-treatment. Here it is at 1 month.
Dr. Steven Rosenberg and his team at the National Cancer Institute believe if the immune system can fight infection, it should also be able to fight cancer.
The virus or a bacteria sets off alarm bells in the immune system. The cancer is barely recognized, and the whole goal of this immunotherapy and gene therapy is to enhance that tiny anti-tumor reaction that the body has that's not effective and magnify it so that it can cause destruction of the cancer.
They did it by injecting tiny genetic tidbits into white cells, giving them the ability to recognize melanoma and kill it.
So these are the cells that have been genetically transformed.
The new genetically altered cells are put back into the body. Research is in the early stages, and this is by no means a cure.
Well, how are you doing today?
Better. But it reflects a new, more targeted approach to treating cancer.
It is possible to genetically modify normal human cells and convert them into cells capable of fighting a cancer and actually destroying it in the human body.
A year and a half after his treatment, Origer shows no evidence of cancer.
Walking her down the aisle, I think I was crying more than anybody. But then it was jubilation, because I was there.
For those of you who are wondering whether this treatment is appropriate for either you or for a loved one, it is so important to remember that this is just a preliminary study. Still, it does seem to be a real step in the right direction.
Now, Doctor, just underline for us, how is this different from chemotherapy and radiation, the treatments we know so much about?
Those therapies, though often effective, have the real problem of often harming normal cells along with the cancer cells. This gene treatment is an example of what's called targeted therapy, a very hot field of research that uses all sorts of techniques to try to kill cancer cells without harming normal cells.
All right, well, that is a big deal. Thank you very much, Doctor. One of the keys to beating cancer is to get screened and catch it early, and you can get a lot more information about all of this on the internet. Go to webmd.com and search cancer screening, and we'll have more CBS Evening News after these messages. Today was the deadline the UN set for Iran to stop enriching uranium that could be used for nuclear weapons or face international sanctions, but Iran's ever-defiant president said he won't let other countries tell Iran what to do, and the UN nuclear watchdog agency confirmed enrichment is still going on. In his speech to the American Legion today, President Bush said Iran is a grave threat to the world and said it must face consequences for its defiance. There was some frightening moments today aboard a U.S. Airways flight from Charlotte, North Carolina. As it was landing in Miami, 2 tires blew out and caught fire. All 118 people on Flight 431 used the escape slides when the plane stopped, and the landing gear fire was put out quickly. No one hurt in that one. The leader of a polygamous sect who was on the FBI's most wanted list appeared in court today in Nevada. Warren Jeffs was arrested Monday in Las Vegas. He told the judge today he won't fight extradition to Utah, where he is charged with arranging marriages of girls as young as 13 to older men. One of the most remarkable and recognizable paintings in the world has been recovered in Norway more than 2 years after it was stolen. Gunmen took The Scream and another masterpiece by Edvard Munch in broad daylight from an Oslo museum. Both paintings were recovered. Police won't say how, but they said no ransom was paid. And for one last time on this broadcast, I'm going to be saying we'll be right back. And trust me, you won't want to, I hope you won't want to miss our special guest. Well, as I mentioned earlier, tonight brings to an end my year and a half here in New York. Next week, I'll be back on my old beat in Washington, but we're ending just the way I like, with a scoop, the first look at our new state-of-the-art newsroom. I can't give you a tour because it's not quite finished yet, but here is someone who will be a permanent fixture, my friend Katie Couric.
Hey, Bob. You know, I can't imagine following in the footsteps of a kinder, more gracious person, so thank you so much for everything. Of course, you'll continue to play a very important role in this broadcast. And before you head back to Washington, though, we want to take a look back because you've had quite a ride.
Here we go. This is the last take, the good take. 5, 4, 3.
Before Bob Schieffer had the grand slam of Washington reporters working every beat inside the Beltway.
Bob Schieffer, CBS News, the White House.
Before he started covering presidential conventions in 1972.
Well, Dan, I think I finally found honest work.
And everyone since. Before he walked the White House grounds with the most powerful leader in the world, he covered a par 2 18th hole.
Bob Schieffer, CBS News at the National Putt-Putt Championships.
Back then, management didn't see Bob as anchor material.
Who wants more pizzazz in the stand-up?
But he became the one CBS turned to in one of its darkest hours.
Good evening, I'm Bob Schieffer, and tonight we turn a page at CBS News.
When Dan Rather stepped down 18 months ago following the National Guard document scandal, at 68, Bob became only the 4th solo anchor of the CBS Evening News.
And you really came in as the replacement quarterback at a really pretty difficult time for CBS News. It was a pretty dark chapter.
We were in a very hard place, Katie, in a very hard place. And I said on the first broadcast, the first thing we have to do is get our credibility back.
It's funny that people have described you as an overnight sensation 4 decades in the making. Is it odd, though, to get so much attention and acclaim at this point in your career?
You want me to tell you a secret? I've really enjoyed it.
Not exactly a well-kept secret to our audience.
In fact, that makes no sense at all.
How long has it been since you've seen someone wearing a monocle?
Bob's been at CBS since he was 32, but started dressing for the job in the 9th grade. He dropped the bow tie to become a beat reporter, covered the JFK assassination at 24, and later the war in Vietnam for his hometown paper in Fort Worth, Texas.
Personally, I'm thrilled to death. I'm a newspaper reporter, and this is the name of the game.
Some 2,000 interviews later,
How can I know that you're telling the truth?
he still sounds a lot like that 26-year-old newspaper man.
We need to go out and find out what happened and then tell people about it in language that they can understand. And when we've done that, it can be a noble thing.
If he seems to keep it all in perspective, it's because he has some. 3 years ago, Bob was diagnosed with bladder cancer. He didn't know if he'd be able to return to a job. He never imagined it would be this one.
I've had a wonderful, wonderful life. And it's a longer life than I probably deserved, and frankly, that even I thought that I would have. And I just hope I can, make good use of the next chapter and the next days.
To be able to say that every new chapter is better than the last is quite a gift, isn't it?
It is, and that's why I feel so fortunate. And some of it was just luck, and I always try to remember that. I'm the product of many things and many people. I don't buy into this self-made man business, from my mom and my wife and my daughters. I really learned from them, and in the end, they helped me and made me what I got to be.
It's so sweet to hear you talk about your family, and Pat and the girls, and other members of your family are here tonight. So, Bob, thanks again, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katie. Thank you very much. You know, most people don't get to hear things like that said about them until their funeral. I'm really glad I got to hear that one. And may I say a word to each of you out there? This was a totally unexpected adventure for me, but I've loved every minute of it. Spending this last year and a half helping to shape and sometimes guide this great news organization has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. In March of last year, you invited me into your homes, but what made me feel good is that you were kind enough to invite me back. I will always remember that. Russ Mitchell will be here tomorrow and Monday, and then it will be the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric. Good night, everyone. I'll see you the next time from Washington.
This is CBS.
Why are you stuffing your money under the mattress?
I'm saving it.
There's a better way. Go Dutch.
Go Dutch with a Dutch Point Credit Union checking account.